Awesome. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I'd love it if you could kick us off by just kind of telling your story of your sustainability journey and what kind of guides you through that.
Yeah, for sure. Super excited to be here. Thanks, Joe. So I think to maybe set the table, I can back up with my mental model for how I've approached my career, even since undergrad for the past 20 years, which makes me feel old saying that, but here we are. Is I've had this North Star of sustainability throughout my career. And the way I want to measure my career is in true product manager fashion is the decarbonization impact that my career can have. So I'm really just looking to work on the biggest levers that can help address climate. And in terms of how I discovered that North Star, I was very lucky in undergrad. I studied aerospace mechanical engineering, and I really struggled for the first 2 years. It was really hard to transition. And it wasn't until I found this group in undergrad called Engineers for a Sustainable World, where I was able to just connect with people that were doing really interesting projects. And I was drawn to it initially because they had budget for you to actually go into the machine shop or go into the lab and build and work on things. And I'm very much not a book learner. I have to see something and do a project to truly grok how that thing works. And so during that whole process of just finding like quote unquote my tribe, I fell in love with sustainability. And so that's led me on this winding journey throughout my career of just when everyone was telling me to zig, I was zagging. And an example of that is like my first ever internship was this is like 2010. It was as a smart grid intern at a utility company, which was kind of crazy. Everyone's like, "Why are you doing this? Like the energy field, the dying field." But I'm like, I just want to learn about the electric grid and work in something sustainability oriented. Then the next internship I took was building out. This is before content creation was a thing, but I was building out content for a website called the Sustainability Workshop that the company Autodesk was creating, and that was essentially a place for architects, engineers, designers to learn how to design more sustainably. And so that was actually one of my first aha moments where I saw the business value of sustainability, where Autodesk saw essentially positioning their tools, their software design tool for, if you're an engineering or architecture firm, you can use their software, or a media and entertainment firm. It's a new use case to say, hey, like if you make your car more efficient, you can do that using our software. So it kind of started to, take these gears and make things start to click for me. Fast forward to after undergrad, I finally relented and listened to people and took a 2-year stint in the defense industry, which was very much not mission aligned. And so quickly pivoted out of that to back to Autodesk on the education team. But in between that, I actually started my own agriculture technology company. We were looking at developing a way to detect disease before the human eye in vineyards. But that was also a nice way for me to light all my personal savings on fire and was the inspiration for me to go to grad school. So got my MBA, and then through the MBA process, ended up at Amazon, where I spent 6 years working on, various different products, mostly into the sustainability field, which I feel grateful and lucky for. And so, yeah, 6 years as a product manager at Amazon. So it's been exciting. And most recently, I was on the Amazon device sustainability team looking at, hey, how do we decarbonize? That team was looking at how do we decarbonize the Amazon devices and services business. But yeah, that's kind of, I think, the long story long of my background.
That's awesome. I'm really curious to dig into some of those design questions and how you approach product management with sustainability in mind. Could you talk a little bit about like how you start a product management process for either a new device or maybe an existing device and a new service or something?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's I feel like the key for any good product manager or any product manager worth their salt, whatever the idiom is quote unquote just build the right thing, which is, a very ambiguous thing, but it's something I always think about is making sure that it's the right thing that your customers want. And one of the things that I also think about, just because I have this bias for sustainability, is is it also good for the planet? Is if our customer is the Earth, is that also good? So it's also making sure in the back of my head, because regardless of where I am, I always see myself as an agent of change. And so I really take that ethos of every job is a climate job, and you can do little things to just have that framing at the back of your head to make sure this is something that's going to move the needle from an environmental perspective. So with building a product from the get-go, I think one of the things that you can think about early on in the process, if you're lucky enough to be able to impact the design, is first off, like ask yourself, like, what's the goal? Is it this new customer experience that you're trying to get, or maybe it's just new customers that you're trying to reach? And so I think with both of those lenses, you can start to bake in sustainability right from the get-go. And I think the only way that you can do that, especially when budgets are tight or it's harder for you to convince people, and companies aren't going to do this out of the goodness of the heart, is to really find, hey, where are the incentives just like overlapping, where it's good for the planet, it's good for the business, and it's good for customers. An example of that in like consumer electronics could be energy efficiency, where, hey, if you buy a TV and instead of it using 100 watts, it's going to use half that at 50 watts. Granted, it's going to be marginal on your energy bill. It's telling that story to customers that we're thinking about you of reducing your energy bill. And then from the corporation perspective, you can start to do all of these, work with the marketing team to figure out that customer segments, maybe they're younger segments that you just haven't been able to reach because you haven't been able to tell your sustainability story in a meaningful way without greenwashing. That's a whole other probably like hour-long conversation. But you can start to create some really strong differentiation for your product. So I think that's kind of setting up the business case and the customer case like right from the get-go. And so, yeah, I'll pause there since that was a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and also it leads me to thinking about kind of how you measure and how you think about the inputs to a product. And I know there's like a framework for inventorying carbon. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and how you think about those, and also just like approaching the kind of the inputs, the supply chain of a product.
Yeah, for sure. So by no means am I an LCA expert. I feel like it's one of those things where the more you know about it, the less you know. So I feel like it's, at least speaking back to my time at Amazon, it's like we had a whole team of like 7 to 10 PhDs that were all developing like our carbon footprinting modeling and doing that LCA or life cycle assessment LCA modeling. But to kind of like speak at a highest level of this, and it's taken me a while, so you might have to edit this in the show notes to make sure I get it right. But essentially, the way you look at a life cycle of a process or life cycle of a product. Let's take something super simple like this water bottle that I'm holding. Generally, they could break the life cycle of this product into 4 phases. You have the materials phase, where it's like, hey, going from mining whatever materials that you need to get to, taking it from the earth, and then putting it to some certain gate that you define. So let's call it like it leaves the factory that it's been produced at. That's like the first life cycle of it. Then the second would be transportation. So from it going to the factory to the customer's house to be used, that would be the transportation phase of it. And then the third aspect, which is much smaller for this water bottle, is the customer use phase. Is, hey, how is this customer actually using this water bottle? An example for a water bottle would be, hey, like, are they actually going to need to put this in the dishwasher? And so how do you start to think about, does your system boundary include the emissions from running that dishwasher or not? And so that's like where the product use phase gets into play. That one's a very hairy because that's starting to scope 3 emissions. But the fourth LCA phase would be end of life, is what happens to this product at the end of life. And it also includes like, hey, how long is the life cycle of this product? So that's like the general like framework of like the 4 buckets of emissions that you would incur throughout the entire process. And then if you think about that as like the vertical buckets of all the emissions, what you were talking about earlier, Joe, of like the scopes is kind of like the horizontals that cut across it. Is different people will have different responsibilities throughout that phase or throughout each of those cycles, from like scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. A good example of like scope 1 emissions would be the energy that's basically directly tied to your utility bill as a company. So that's like the energy that you would be using. Like if you were the factory owner, your scope 1 emissions would be, you're plugged in to whatever electric grid, all the emissions associated with that. Scope 2 would be kind of like one layer deep into that, where it'd be like emissions like of your supplier potentially. And then Scope 3 emissions, as an example, would be another layer of product use phase. And this is really interesting in the consumer electronics world, where if you're a company and a manufacturer of a consumer electronic, your Scope 3 emissions is actually the carbon associated with the electricity that your customers use. So that goes back to this water bottle example. So if this water bottle was actually like a television that's plugged into the wall, the Scope 3 emissions of that, OEM of that device would actually be all the carbon associated with those electrons. So it's interesting to think of how that breaks some of the mental models of like where the biggest emissions might lie, depending on who you are. And that's like a very like abstract, like high level. Like I think if you have like LCA experts on here, they can keep me honest here, but that's kind of like a quick, like the best, like, Reddit explain like I'm five description that I can give the LCA and Scope 1 through 3 emissions.
Yeah. So how do you, as you're building products or iterating on products, how do you think about the different design decisions that you make where, one design decision might reduce your carbon footprint, but it might increase the cost by a little bit, and thinking about, different features or characteristics of a product. How do you approach those? I would assume very difficult decisions to make the product continue to serve its use while also reducing its carbon footprint.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to basically do that inventory of like, Scope 1 through 3 emissions, figure out with your product, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Like I'm not saying you need to have like perfect analysis where it's like, hey, I'm building a product and I need to know within like 0.001% emissions for all of these. I think that's impossible, and it's not impossible, but it's like extra costly and it's not worth your time. I think one of the best ways that you can do this is to take a high level analysis like of your device. And there's plenty of like online frameworks, and even some of like the new LLMs and AI tools can actually give you like a BOM analysis and like a rough carbon footprint. Because what you want to do very quickly in the design process isn't necessarily inventory for a carbon accounting perspective, but more for a decarbonization lever perspective to say, hey, I'm designing this new cell phone, and I know that my cell phone is actually going to have, roughly 60 to 80% of the emissions are going to be the embodied emissions, or the materials and the emissions from the materials life cycle, and 20% is going to be in the use phase. So actually, that's where I'm going to make the biggest changes, like to the device, and that kind of goes into the supply chain question of like, just by me doing that mental like math of like, oh, 80% of the emissions or 60% of the emissions are in the embodied phase, like there's going to be some big levers to pull in there. Versus like if I was designing a television that's always plugged in, that ratio is going to switch where 60 to 80% of the emissions are going to come from the Scope 3 use phase emissions, and 20 to 40% are the embodied emissions. So I think just kind of understanding like the product category that you're operating in is going to start to help you do like the big levers. And then back to like the whole water bottle example is like, I know that I'm guessing at least that the majority of emissions are probably from the plastic that's associated with this, and then maybe even just how it's transported as well. And that's where, to your earlier question about like pre-design versus post-design, is if you have a product that is very heavy, or even just any product, I guess, like thinking about how it's going to get to your customers also becomes like very strategic and important, where, if you're designing something, and it's coming in super hot, you're under a tight timeline, you're going to try to just get it to customers as soon as possible. Like, you missed a couple deadlines and you have to make sure it ships before like the holiday season for sales reasons, that might make you have to air ship something. And that's going to spike your emissions like in a massive, meaningful way. Versus, and you can bake that decision earlier on into the process to say, oh, like we have to ocean ship this because it's just going to be less carbon intense than air transport. So those are some of like the design decisions that you can start to suss out. And then maybe even to take a step back from that is starting to think about like incentive alignment. And so if you think about I don't know, just because like that's like one of the biggest, like I said earlier, like from Autodesk, like the biggest aha moments that I had during my internship of like, finding the business value is like that's when corporations will really go is just looking at carrots and sticks. Obviously, people like sticks, or sorry, like carrots way more than sticks. And an example of that would be like, hey, if I'm designing this product, if you're not getting any traction from like you're saying, hey, I can't really find the business case for doing this. Maybe there's actually like pending regulation that if you do pursue the more sustainable option, it's actually going to de-risk us and we can enter like the European market. And that's like a stick incentive. It's harder to like get alignment for us because it's like people are like, oh, I have to do this. And then the panacea or the sweet spot for this would be, hey, I can say with clear results that, hey, if I do this sustainable attribute and market that to my customers, I'm going to increase sales by like X percent. It begs like a whole different question of like degrowth and like, just capitalism. But knowing that that's the current system boundaries of like we have to operate in the system, I've been thinking as hard as I can of like how do we find just aligned incentives between like the sticks, which is harder, but mostly the carrots, because that's what gets people excited. Is because then it's win-win and people will just want to come to you.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier kind of the sustainability storytelling. Um, can you talk about like the information that consumers, specifically like the consumer electronics space, the information that consumers are engaged with, whether it's certifications or credentials, or maybe it's data in some scenarios. I think you talked about energy efficiency as one example of like how consumers can engage with the sustainability of the product and think about it.
Yeah, I think one of the best examples is actually Energy Star. And it was funny, I was listening to like another podcast. I can't remember, I think it was on like the MTJ, My Climate Journey podcast, talking about like it was one of the architects of the Energy Star program. And I think she was like an executive at Dell. And she just saw like a huge energy problem where, you had this like essentially this 300-watt heater that was always on. And there was no incentive for, desktop companies to ever turn that off. And it was just spiking huge energy. So she basically worked with Energy Star and the EPA to create a way to show customers that, oh, this device actually only uses, 100 kilowatt hours or like whatever that number, 100 kilowatts, or 100 kilowatt hours like in a year. And you can start to gauge this. And so that's been one of the key ways where a stick started off as a carrot, where, these companies like, customers, if they didn't see that Energy Star, they just wouldn't buy your product because they're like, oh, like it's going to be more energy inefficient. And it's funny, like I can think very, very viscerally back to 20 years ago when I was with my, at my parents' house growing up in like 7th, 8th grade. And, I'm, on the family computer, I'm always leaving it on because there might be like Napster downloading. And I'm like, oh, you have to download this. But my mom's like, hey, it's crazy energy bills. Like, what are you doing? Like, it's so much. So I think that's where you started to see this just aligned incentive where customers like, I can actually save money on this appliance. And so you're going to buy more of it. A great example of that in practice for consumer electronics is with smart thermostats and thermostats in general. You can see that devices like anything from like the Ecobee thermostats to Nest or Honeywell Home or Resideo or Amazon thermostats. A lot of these companies, or Emerson even, like goes for the Energy Star certification. And one of the unlocks from an Energy Star certification, at least in the thermostat space, is if you get certified as an Energy Star certified thermostat, many of the utilities that customers have use that simple binary approach to say, hey, if this device is Energy Star certified, we can actually give you a rebate for that. So it's also driving the price down from customers for a whole variety of reasons too. So for clear-cut cases like that, where there is a certification that is in your category, it might actually drive like, because it effectively takes your $300 thermostat to, $225 if you're getting the $75 rebate. So that's a way to think about certifications is like, are you going to get a competitive advantage of effectively lowering your price? And then I think for others, like if I'm like, and granted, I don't have any experience making laundry machines, but I did just buy one. But it seems just like par for the course where like if you don't have that Energy Star sticker, I wouldn't even consider it. Granted, am a huge climate nerd, and I was like, I have to be a heat pump. So that was a whole different like thing that I went down when I was shopping for one. But yeah, that's kind of like the framing at least is like know your category for what you're creating, and then see if there's a certification that is well known to customers, or that can help you just differentiate and stand out for your customer set.
Yeah. You mentioned the transportation earlier. I'm curious if you have like a a sense for where the most common like low-hanging fruit are for um reducing the carbon footprint of a product, or if there are kind of things that you've learned over time of like there are these trade-offs. I think you might have mentioned earlier, or maybe when we were talking before the recording, about the trade-off between packaging and transportation, and thinking about like the energy
Yeah, yeah,
use for like those different elements and phases.
yeah, no, for sure. And that begs to the question from like sustainability perspective. And I have a lot of like friends in the sustainability space that always have to keep me honest. Like there was an article in the New York Times maybe 3 years ago where it's like instead of like tech bros, it was decarb bros. And so it's basically like people that are only focused on carbon emissions sometimes can miss the boat. And I'm like very guilty of this because I'm just horse blinders for carbon. And an example of that is like the debate between like recently, I think it was New York State and Washington and California. They implemented regulations to not use forever chemicals like PFAS, OFRs in plastics. But that might actually change because you're changing the composition of your plastic, as an example, with to meet regulations to make a safer, like healthier plastic. I say healthier, but in quotes. But with that, it might increase the carbon footprint because you're changing the chemistry. So maybe it's a more carbon intensive process. Maybe like a better like example that's more visceral for people to wrap their head around is like if you imagine a product, and this has been a huge effort for sustainable packaging across like all the consumer electronics, like from Sonos to Google to Amazon, is they've taken all these commitments to remove plastics from their shipping or from their the containers that they ship in. But if you think about that, the replacement for that plastic is most likely a heavier cardboard or paper-based or wood pulp-based product. And so if you're thinking about then the carbon emissions from a holistic perspective of like scope 1 through 3, you're actually going to start to increase by switching to this renewable resource of paper-based products. You could potentially spike your carbon emissions in the transportation phase just because you simply have a heavier project or heavier product. And then, if you're shipping like, not to pick on Sonos, it's just top of mind, is like if you're shipping Sonos speakers with like an extra, I don't know, 20 grams, 30 grams, multiply that by a million speakers, you start to see like it's a much heavier product. So your overall like shipping like emissions might rise. But like, again, you have to like think about from the very beginning on the design phase of like, what's the goal? And so you as a company, you might have like goals of like broad goals from sustainability where, hey, we want safer chemistries. We want to just get rid of plastics. Or maybe you're very carbon focused to say, hey, like it's decarbonization or nothing. And then you can start to make these trade-offs. But I wish there was like a more elegant just to say, oh, like, yeah, we switch this, it's good, but you just kind of have to think longer term. And then there's even like the 3 or 4 or 5 years, like later on, is if you get super deep into this, like, using a renewable resource like wood paper might just be better from a carbon perspective in the long run, but it might not be, you might not get carbon credit for it just because the customer is going to be able to recycle that and you're going to be able to reuse that product versus the plastic, which is most likely just going to get thrown out and sit in a landfill. So super complex, hairy topic. But again, it's like another like hour, if not like week long, like discussion that people will just debate and like about this. But I think just like taking a step back of just thinking about the whole process and like what your goal is can help you make those decisions. Like, yeah, when you're approaching, especially from an early perspective.
Yeah. Well, so I'm curious, just thinking about the future and how things are developing. What do you think the future of product management in the context of sustainability is? Do you see it? Well, one, do you see it currently as something that's mainstream, and if not, do you see it getting there pretty quickly? And how do you think that things will develop?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think about like, it's funny, like, right after I graduated undergrad in like 2012 was like clean tech 1.0 is what they called it, when like you had like Solyndra and there was like this $800 million loan that got put out. So people were starting to put some decent sized investments into the space, but it was still early in the technological cycle, the readiness phase. And so it kind of like puttered out, come like 2014, 2015. But I remember just being so excited that there was a little bit of momentum there. And then now over the past like 3 years, it feels like climate tech has kind of become the new term of like clean tech 2.0, like whatever you want to call it. And more people are excited. So it's like very exciting to me overall that there's just more of a critical mass for getting things done. And I think it goes back to just incentives. I think, maybe just to oversimplify, like one of the, looking at where all of like global carbon emissions, a huge part of that is electricity. And now you're starting to see it when you're faced with, should I spin up like a natural gas plant? That's probably a bad idea, but like a coal plant or an oil plant versus solar. It's like solar is going to win from a cost perspective. So you're just seeing these cost aligned incentives, but that was also only possible because like there was all this upfront investment that happened to it. So I think from like what I'm trying to say there is like from a meta point, I'm excited about just the overall focus on sustainability, where you're starting to the overlap of, people that if it's good for the planet and good for business is just getting bigger, which I think is a good thing, because then you're going to have more investment. And then it's this flywheel that's like, oh, it's like we're starting to see that the right thing for our business is also the right thing for the planet, and continue to drive that. And then from a product management perspective, it's really interesting where I think like this current like market, you're seeing just like an overall like flattening of like product management. And I think AI is just this thing that's this 800-pound gorilla in the room that people are talking about. And I'm curious just to see how product management changes and evolves with AI. One of the best like frameworks that I've heard is AI is just an accelerant, where it's going to take a really bad product manager and just make their ideas worse because they have easier access to making something look like a mock-up. And if you're like a really good product manager, it's an amplifier rather, and it's going to amplify like a really good product manager. And so you're going to start to see this like further like chasm of like, good product versus bad product management. But in relation to carbon, I think something I think about is a lot is, and you're starting to see a lot of this with AI in the news, is that it's way more carbon intensive to do an AI based function versus a traditional like search. I think if you just take like Google search for an example, it's like much more expensive to ask Claude or ChatGPT or even Gemini versus just typing it into Google. So if you start to compound that cost, like it starts to become like worrisome. I'm more optimistic from a carbon perspective with AI, just because it's driving this massive demand in renewable energy. It's like one of the first times the electric grid has actually seen, there's like massive backlog of projects in the queue right now for, I think it's something like 2.5 terawatts, which is double the capacity of our current electric grid that's just in the queue waiting to go. So I'm like less concerned. There's definitely concerning parts of it, but I think it's going to drive overall demand for more sustainable renewable energies. But that's also, I'm thinking about it from an optimistic view. But in terms of like how it will evolve product management, people that aren't with AI or aren't in the sustainability field, I go back to just, thinking about if you care about sustainability and you are passionate about this, like you can make your job a climate job. I think Drawdown Labs is a really good resource for people that actually have a whole like course on like, hey, how can you make your every job a climate job? And I think about that a lot, even when I was working in the defense industry, and I know I shared this before we started recording, but everyone within the company had to get certified. It's called Six Sigma certification. It's essentially like factory efficiency is a way to think about it. How do you make a manufacturing process more efficient? And, the defense company that I was working at, like, did not care 1 ounce at that point in time about sustainability, but I just made it like my mental model of like, because I had agency to pick the project that I was working on. And I just wanted to pick a project that I could mentally tie in the back of my head to, reducing waste for a manufacturing process. And I could quantify, like if we use less, X product, it's going to have like an overall decarbonization perspective. But the output of that presentation was actually, hey, we saved X dollars of cost, but my, internal like framing that I had in my head was like, oh, saving this is actually going to save emissions, and it's also going to save cost. So I think you can think about like choices that you're making as like an everyday product manager, to make your little actions like more efficient. And I think an example of that could even be like using AI or not using AI. If you're like Google searching something like like an analysis of a report. I know that there's all these like deep research tools that came out with like Perplexity, and even Claude and ChatGPT have come out with this. Maybe you could just Google it instead of like choosing to do this like crazy 30-minute analysis and spooling up like 10 servers somewhere. You can probably get the job done somewhere else. That's like a small example. And then the other example is just, product managers are very customer focused. So you can start to think about sustainability as this competitive advantage for yourself and for your product to say, hey, maybe we haven't been thinking about sustainability at all. Like maybe you're a software product manager and you have the opportunity to actually calculate the carbon emissions impact of each of your like queries or whatever you're working on and spit that back to the customer. That might just give you this awesome differentiation that your competitors don't have, that you might gain more market share from that. So starting to think about that of like, hey, how can we like create these win-win scenarios, I think are super interesting. But I've always seen myself as kind of this internal agent of change that's always going to like put my decarbonization hat on no matter where I am, for better or for worse.
Yeah, that's really inspiring to think about more people like you working as internal agents of change. So I want to maybe ask one more question of what advice would you give to somebody who's thinking about a sustainability career right now? Maybe they're just on the verge of graduating their undergrad and thinking about a career in sustainability.
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful things is I made a conscious effort to really start, because it's kind of like what you consume is what you become. And I think that's true both for, not for food, like I'm not going to turn into a pink flamingo by eating only shrimp, but like if you start to just, and this, I've tried to make a better habit of this, but all the media that I consume is like very climate focused, and also like science, with a small asterisk of science fiction, because I just love sci-fi, but I'm just taking this constant, like, be it the books that I read or the accounts that I follow on social media or the podcasts that I listen to, I really just try to find like that just overall just slow burn. Because I think when I talk to a lot of people about breaking into sustainability, they kind of see it as like, I have to do this like right now. And like, I totally get that urgency for it. But you can also think about it as like, it's a journey and you're going to have this winding career path and you can take it slow. But the best way, I think, is just to really immerse yourself and just to allow yourself the grace to like slow burn and like get up to speed and to start consuming all of this. So I would just like, if I could sum that up, just be really curious and, don't be afraid to ask questions. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And I hope we can have another conversation down the road.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Joe.